Hello, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in this afternoon to Lessons from the Past, how ISAW students are taking their studies forward during COVID-19. For those of you who don't know, ISAW, the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, is a graduate school and research institute of NYU located in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Our aim as an institute is to encourage particularly the study of the economic, religious, political, and cultural connections between ancient civilizations. ISAW is comprised of a doctoral program with a dedicated faculty, a visiting research scholar program, several archaeological field projects, a substantial library, a portfolio of innovative digital projects, a highly visible and successful exhibition program, a robust public lecture series, all of which reflect ISAW's broad intellectual terrain. Rod Campbell, who is moderating our discussion today, is here as both the Director of Graduate Studies and the Associate Professor of East Asian Archaeology and History at ISAW. He received his PhD from Harvard with a dual degree in both anthropology, archaeology, and archaeology, specifically archaeology, and East Asian languages and civilization. His research has mostly focused on the Shang Dynasty and the Chinese Bronze Age on topics ranging from socio-political organization to violence. He has multiple fieldwork collaborations with various Chinese institutions, all focused on reconstructing elements of the late Shang economy, and his other current major research focus is on early Chinese visual culture. So Rod, if you'd like to take it away, introduce our student participants and begin.
Hi, thank you for that introduction, Iris. So we have 3 students today in very different stages of their PhD progress. I'm going to go alphabetically, beginning with Amber Jacobs, a 4th year PhD student with a background in Egyptology, focusing on the Greco-Roman period and interested in questions of intercultural connection. Her dissertation involves a translation of an unpublished corpus of Egyptian medical papyri and the comparison of that body with contemporaneous Greek medical papyri. Our next student, Emily Everest Phillips, is a 2nd year student with a background in modern intellectual history in the Byzantine world. She is now an aspiring global medieval historian. She's interested in intellectual contacts across Eurasia, particularly diasporic survivals of Sasanian culture and ideas after the Islamic conquest. And Lorenzo Castellano is in the final stages of his PhD, finishing up his dissertation, a dissertation on nature and culture in early historic Anatolia, reconstructing human environmental interactions in Hittite and post-Hittite Anatolia. So I'd like to start with Amber, and I'd like to ask you, what has been your experience as a student during the pandemic?
So I was in New York when the pandemic started. I was just finishing up. I had the end of my coursework done, and I was TAing one of the NYU undergraduate core courses downtown. So we had very quickly gone from a lot of kind of anxiety about the pandemic to NYU made the call to move to remote classes. At the time, they'd announced it would be for 2 weeks, one of which was over spring break, and then to kind of see how things would go from there. So I think at that early point, I didn't really know what to expect. I had a trip planned home back to Vancouver. I'm Canadian, just for the 1 week of spring break. So I packed my kind of 1 week bag and headed home, and then it became very apparent very quickly that the state of the situation was going to be a lot worse and that we'd be moving remote for the entire semester. A lot of the kind of lockdowns happened and the spread really took off quickly here. So there was that kind of deciding moment of, do I stay in Canada and kind of wait this out there, or do I come back to New York?
So you were at a kind of crucial, you were at a kind of crucial juncture in your program as well. So not only TAing and taking classes, but also preparing for your comprehensive exams.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about that experience?
So that was one of the more difficult aspects, especially in making the decision to come back or not. I didn't have the resources with me. So when you leave for a week, you don't really think, what do I need for the entire next semester? And I hadn't really started to gather those reading lists together yet. So I had nothing on my computer. In Canada, the libraries were also shut down. So there was that problem of just not being able to get the resources that I need to study for those exams. And then we kind of made an emergency meeting with my supervisory committee at ISAW and tried to make a kind of workaround where maybe I would push comps back to the next semester and then take that semester's activity, the dissertation proposal, and prepare that ahead of time. But that also ended up having similar problems, which was lack of resources. So at the end of the day, both projects have ended up being pushed back in my degree.
Right. But on the other hand, you know, you had an interesting workaround for the issue of, you know, so if you can't prepare for your comps, so what do? One option would be to do nothing and just take extra time. Another option would be to try to work around. So what was your solution to this?
So I did kind of as much as I could in terms of the workaround. So my dissertation proposal is now well underway. There's some sections of it that are still lacking where the resources need to come in, but there is now a general framework in place. And so I think even though it technically has been pushed back, by the time my comps come around, it will be really quick to finish up that project. So it's still going to end up being a shorter delay than would have been caused otherwise.
Yeah, that's great. So resourceful.
Thank you.
Thanks. I want to ask now Emily what her experience of COVID-19, sort of what happened when it began, and yeah, what your experience was.
Sure, thanks, Rod. So I had a similar experience to Amber in a way. I'm in the coursework phase of my PhD, so I was just taking classes, and then we moved online very quickly and quite impressively. And then I was meant to come back home to the UK, which is where I am still now, just for a week. So I packed a little suitcase and came home. And then not only did the situation in the US continue, but then the UK also had a lockdown. So I'm still here. I decided to stay here and I'm continuing to do my coursework all remotely. And ISAW especially has been so flexible and kind because of things like time difference. You know, sometimes it's a bit too late for me to have a class and things like that. And in general, I found, although I similarly have some issues with resources, I've luckily been able to access libraries in London, and lots of things have been digitized, and we've been given extra access to things that usually we wouldn't have access to online, which is great. And yeah, I've actually, sometimes I find it's quite great because I'm 5 hours ahead. So I'll send an email and it's 5 a.m. for all of you. And you must think I'm so efficient and amazing. So far it's been nice. But yeah, I do miss everyone. I especially miss lunch and the community. So it'll be nice to come back as well.
So Emily, you raise an interesting point. All of you are in different stages of your PhD, and therefore the access to resources means something really different for each of you. So whether you're taking courses or whether you're doing dissertation research or even trying to do field work, having access or not having access can mean something radically different. NYU has wonderful digital resources, but that doesn't help you if you're trying to access unpublished Egyptian papyri. And Lorenzo, I understand, had a similar set of issues. Could you tell us about it, Lorenzo?
Yes, definitely, because, Rod, we are not archaeologists, so we study things, and in order to keep going with our research, we need to have access to the things that we are studying, right? So in my specific case, one of the core area of my research is archaeobotany, and in a second I can just provide a very brief background about what actually means. So in my terms means that I need to have access to samples and to a lab where to analyze those samples. Otherwise my research cannot keep going. Yep, please.
So I'm sure people listening might not know what archaeobotany is. we do a lot of different things at ISAW, which may seem rather arcane to people outside. So maybe you could just tell us basically what archaeobotany actually is about.
So in a few words, is the study of the relationship between people and plants on the basis of the evidence from archaeological sites. So basically, in each archaeological layer, there is a quantity of wood charcoal, of seeds, and other botanical remains. There are relatively simple ways to extract that material, to analyze it in a lab setting. And in this way, we can learn about the history of agriculture, about which crops were cultivated, which crops were traded, and also about the vegetation that was growing around the site. So this is something that can give us opportunity to have some insights about those topics on ancient economies and ancient environments. So just in a few words, in my case, we have an excavation in central Anatolia, so in today Turkey. Each summer, we spend a couple of months there. Beside all the other archaeological work, we collect a huge amount of soils. We are able to extract from that soil those botanical remains. I ship those samples here at NYU, and it's where I can do my analysis that are going to be part of my dissertation. So considering that I am in the last stages of my dissertation, to have access to those samples, to have access to the lab where to do my analysis was very important during the pandemic. So it was something that I had to find some workaround in order to be able to keep doing this work, keep meeting the deadlines that were expecting me, and so on. And so basically, as soon as I realized that the situation was getting bad, I decided to play before time, so to rent a car, go downtown in the main campus, pack everything from my lab, and bring everything in my apartment uptown. So that was able, even with the lockdown, to keep the work going. And it was possible for three main reasons. First of all, because in order to do archaeobotany, we use a very simple type of equipment, basically just a microscope and a few other small pieces of equipment. So it's nothing too expensive, it's nothing too complicated, and it's all stuff that you could move around very easily. Second of all, it's not dangerous because I just take a seed or a charcoal, I put under the microscope, so there isn't any safety concern in doing that type of work outside a formal lab. And finally, because I start the lab myself, so most of the equipment I personally own it, so I didn't need to go through the university with paperwork in order to have the authorization to move pieces of equipment outside the university building. So altogether was a way, to try to mitigate all this war situation and try to have my research keep going, even in those sort of totally unexpected scenario in which we find ourselves in these days.
So I have a question. I mean, you mentioned that you actually own this equipment yourself. How did that work? Are you just fabulously wealthy, or how are you able to purchase this equipment?
So the equipment is relatively cheap because they're just microscope, and you can, it's not terribly expensive. Being in New York, the most complex thing is to find yourself in your small apartment, and at the same time also your lab in your living room, because you can understand that we have a very generous fellowship from ISAW, but the rent that we can afford in New York City implies to have a very small apartment, to share it with a roommate. So to build up a lab in your living room is something that is complicated from a logistic point of view. But with a little bit of creativity, it's possible to try to find a ways to make things work. So just enough to try to be open-minded, trying to find solution to a very small problem that you're going to find, and in this way you can mitigate those sort of situation.
Great. So I have a question for Amber. I'm curious about this untranslated body of material that you're going to be working on for your dissertation. Untranslated, unpublished. So does that mean, I guess I have two questions. One, for the preparation of your dissertation proposal, is this one of the resources that you really need access to in order to complete your dissertation proposal? And if so, how do you get access? I assume there's no digital copy of this since it hasn't been published. Do you have to physically go to Egypt to see it?
So the papyri I'm working on are actually housed in a papyrus collection in Copenhagen, Denmark.
Okay.
They're part of the Papyrus Carlsberg collection. And there's about, I want to say, roughly 300 fragments. It's very much like putting together a giant puzzle. So we have bits of maybe about 7 different manuscripts that need to be reconstructed. Now, for my part, I also, before the pandemic, traveled to Copenhagen regularly. So on one of those previous trips, I was able to get scans of most of them. And some of those scans are better. Some of them, they hadn't yet been put into glass frames. And so you have an opportunity to very delicately place the piece onto the scanner directly. And those scans are very good. Some of the other ones are already housed in temporary glass frames. And so to open those up is a little bit of a different story. So you scan them within the glass. And then the problem is with that extra space and the extra reflectivity, you sometimes can't tell things like if a certain dark spot on the scan is actually damage, if it's dirt, if it's ink, like there are places that just become a little bit obscured. So for my part, I'm very lucky that I have scans of almost all of the material. And that is, there will be a few holes that we'll just have to say, something in my dissertation proposal to the effect of, I'll deal with that part later. And then for the most part, it's now kind of anytime I find one of those ambiguities that can't be resolved by looking at the digital copy, then I note the inventory numbers. And when travel opens up again, next time I'm back in Copenhagen, then I'll pull out the actual papyri and put them under microscopes and start looking a little bit more closely at what's happening. So for the most part, it hasn't been too affecting.
Wow. So that, I mean, I didn't realize that. You're essentially trying to reconstruct like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle when your dog has like chewed on half the pieces.
Yes, and you don't know how much of it you have.
Right.
So at this point, I've at least identified that there's at least 7 distinct manuscripts in the material that's preserved.
Wow.
And we don't really know kind of how long were these manuscripts. We know they're compilations of earlier texts. So at some point they would have been written in an earlier phase of the language. And then at the time of these texts, which is about the 1st to 2nd century CE, they would have been translated into the later script, Demotic. And we still have, there's some little tantalizing pieces that point back to an earlier time, but we don't know. Some of these manuscripts, compilation manuscripts that we have from Egypt are massive. They take up an entire room. The scrolls are so long. So we don't know with this anthology yet if we're going to be able to find the evidence of how long these original manuscripts were. So yes, it's like doing a puzzle piece where you only have a certain number of the pieces and you don't know what the full puzzle is supposed to look like.
Wow. So these are fragments of medical documents in Egyptian. You mentioned Demotic. Could you say what period you think these span? Is it Greco-Roman?
It is. So the papyri themselves were certainly copied down in the 1st to 2nd centuries AD. But the material beforehand, it's really hard to assess how far back it goes because before this material, there's a rather long gap. We have a lot of material coming out of the kind of New Kingdom over 1,000 years earlier than my texts. And then from that time to the time of my texts, there's a handful of medical papyri that have been preserved. So the chances of being able to look at these texts and find earlier precedents for this type of treatment is really limited. And some things, one of the markers is if you find a personal name on the text, sometimes the name of the compiler is included, and you can kind of tell based on the name, at least when that person was compiling the earlier version. And now we don't know how much earlier the material that person was drawing from is, but at least gives us a little hint that it's much older.
Cool. So if I understand the project, is it true that, so essentially you're comparing this body of Greco-Roman Egyptian medical texts with contemporaneous Greek ones?
Yes.
And is the issue then to see to what degree, I don't know, contemporaneous Egyptians borrow from the Greek or the Greeks borrow from the Egyptians, or whether they share the same sort of universe of medical thought?
Right. So we know that they don't really share the same worldview of medical thought because we have a lot of medical texts from the Greek world. We have a lot of earlier medical texts from the Egyptian world, but there have been in the past attempts in scholarship to make that type of a comparison. But in the past, what has always happened is that people are taking Greek texts that are maybe 500 to 1,000 years later than the Egyptian texts that they're comparing them to. So the comparison is really problematic. You just can't get you can't ask meaningful questions about influence or borrowings when your texts are that far apart and have no contact really. So with the material that I'm working on, because it's so late and it has a known archaeological context, which is really rare for Egyptian medical papyri, but it comes from a site in the Fayum that is very well documented. It's Teptunis is the name of the ancient city. And then from that same site, there are at least 14 Greek medical papyri that have been unearthed as well. And they're very likely, the priests at this time, the Egyptian priests that would be responsible for copying the medical texts would be bilingual. So it's more or less assumed that these are copied by the same priests in the same temple. They're all part of one temple library deposit. And so we know that that the people that are behind copying the text have access to both traditions. So the question then arises is there evidence of interaction or translation or borrowings in either way? And if so, what are they borrowing, right? Something like adopting a foreign worldview is quite unlikely, right? But what may be more likely is adopting the practical side of it. Are there certain recipes that are being traded back and forth? Is there a trade in the pharmacopoeia and the ingredients that you can see happening between these texts? And that's something that previously hasn't been even possible to really address those questions. And the Greek texts are all published and none of the Demotic texts are. So it's kind of waiting on the publication of the Demotic text to be able to start doing some of that research.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Emily, I know that you were working on something interesting during the break, over the summer even. Essentially, if not exactly a workaround, the way you said it to me was sort of the quarantine and the fact that we're all in separate places sort of gave you sort of afforded you the opportunity to work on this. Why don't you tell us what your project has been?
Sure. So I decided, I think during the lockdown, I experienced this kind of, I'm sure lots of other people did as well. There was kind of a renaissance of audio as a medium, and there was, you know, podcasts, like people always listening to podcasts, and I thought actually what ISAW could do with is something like a podcast, and that's exactly what I've been working on. And so I've recorded a few episodes now. It's going to be called In Other Worlds. And in each episode, I'm going to interview someone from the ISAW broader community. So whether that's permanent faculty or students or visiting research scholars. And we have other people sort of within the orbit of ISAW. And we also, of course, have the exhibitions and other exciting projects that people have worked on. So it's just an opportunity to talk about kind of some of this research and make it public in a way that is hopefully really easy to access, because, you know, a podcast is, yeah, you can just listen to it while you're on the way to work or something, and hopefully make it fun and interesting and sort of relevant as well to the world today. So yeah.
That sounds great. So I'm curious about what's your programming? How many podcasts have you finished so far, and what are the topics?
Okay, so 3 have been recorded and are in the editing stage. So our very first one is an interview with Xin Wen, who is a visiting research scholar that we had last year, who's very brilliant. He's from Princeton and he studies the Silk Road and the Dunhuang documents. And he's got a book that's coming out, and he's got a very, very interesting take on he can read all these amazing languages, and he's read all these texts, and he's got a really interesting take on the Silk Road travelers being, his focus is on diplomats rather than merchants, which is usually the focus. Then the second episode, I've got another visiting research scholar from last year called Focaline Kustra, and she works on linguistics. She uses social linguistics, but also reconstructing ancient pre-Arabic Semitic languages in northwestern Saudi Arabia from rock inscriptions. So kind of talking about the materiality of inscriptions rather than texts, and how you start to reconstruct ancient languages. That's a very interesting kind of question. And then talking about the kind of the implications of what we know about language from social linguistics, how we can apply that, or if we can apply that to the ancient world, to find out more about how, how people lived. And then finally, I interviewed you about your research, and that was really fun. And we talked a lot about, this mystery of the late Shang human sacrifice, and this phenomenon that was later forgotten in Chinese history. And they were remembered as these great kings who were very kind and benevolent. And the fact that they'd ritualistically killed tens of thousands of people in these huge pits was kind of forgotten, and why that was. So yeah, very exciting. And we've got a few more in the works. So hopefully they'll get recorded soon.
Sounds great. So a lot of variety, a lot of different topics. I think it's so wonderful to see you guys, of your own initiative, branching out and doing all sorts of fascinating things. I want to turn the question now to teaching. Between us, I think we're either, most of us either teaching, being taught, or TAing, which is also teaching. So I'm interested in hearing from you about your experiences attempting to teach during the pandemic. So we shifted over to Zoom. How did that go, Amber?
I think at the first it was a little bit of a struggle because it happened so suddenly. I know I had never even heard of Zoom when this whole thing went down. And then within 48 hours, you've got it up and running on your computer with an 80 student class and managing breakout rooms and just trying to revamp your entire teaching strategy. So it was a little bit of a whirlwind at the start, but it worked very well. And I think one of the things that really made it work was the flexibility of the students. When you have 80 students in a class, you think that there's going to be a lot of frustration or kickback on switching over so quickly. But I actually found that it was the students who were making a really good go of it. They were very patient, they were very helpful. And so that for me was a really big one. Switching over to teaching in another time zone was also certainly a challenge. My 8 a.m. classes suddenly became 5 a.m. classes. So that was a little crazy, but you also have students that have gone home as well. So you're dealing with students in different time zones, and every now and then something really sweet happens. Like they don't have to show up for the 5 a.m. class because at that time they're allowed just to watch the recording later. But I actually had a student in California who showed up every time at 5 a.m. just to be in solidarity because she knew that I was doing it too. So I think in that sense, there was a lot of technical difficulties at the start. But there was also a sense in which I think, even though you don't have your students with you in person, there's almost a sense where I feel like I got to know them a little bit better because everybody was struggling. And I think that added a human element to it that really encouraged people to reach out and be supportive. So, and now I hear that it's going, I'm not teaching this semester, I'm teaching again next semester when hopefully all of the bugs will be sorted out. But I hear already the system is really improving.
That's great. So Emily, you're not teaching yet, I don't think, but you have been in seminars and classes. So what was your experience of doing seminars during the pandemic?
I mean, similar to Amber, really. It was a bit strange getting used to, I think we've all got better at some of the etiquette. Like, I suppose we're all much more forgiving if a pet or something suddenly sweeps across the screen, or someone's child walks into the room. But also, I think I've definitely learned that I think because of the screen interface, you really have to, just sitting there passively, quietly, doesn't help the dynamic of the class at all. And I think everyone gets quite tired quite quickly. So I think I've learned to really make an effort to speak out and ask questions and keep that conversation going to get to, ensure that everyone's having a class that, try and recreate the experience of being in the same room together as much as possible. Again, time difference, I'm ahead 5 hours, so I now have mostly evening classes, which can be a bit tiring, but it means I have the whole day to do the work for it. So actually works out quite well for me. And I've had, there was one particular experience which was great, which was an ISAW tutor for an ISAW seminar, very kindly let us move the time of the class because I had a clash. And I really don't think that could have ever happened if we were all in person, because he would have had to book a room for the class, and I would have just had to pick one or the other. But he was incredibly obliging because it was all online, and everyone else in the class was too. So we managed to move it an hour so I could attend both classes. And the other thing is that if you do have back-to-back classes, you now can do both because you don't have to travel. So all of that's been really positive for me.
Yeah, no, you're right. Actually, Zoom does afford an ease of scheduling that isn't there if you have to commute 2 hours into New York or something like I do. Lorenzo, you're at a different stage in your process. You're looking to the job market, I think, and acquiring teaching experience as a primary instructor. Could you tell us how, obviously the pandemic has affected the job market, and sort of you're looking to the future and beyond the PhD. How has that, how has the pandemic and affected all of that?
I mean, first of all, about teaching, unfortunately, I was supposed to teach a class during the J term, is the next semester, at anthropology. And the class was supposed to be an introduction to archaeobotany. So a place in which I provide some general theory. We are going to address together the history of plant domestication, some history of agriculture, and so on. But we are going to spend also a lot of time working together at the microscope with a group of students that are looking both modern materials and materials from archaeological sites. And unfortunately, as you can understand, that this is something that in Zoom it's impossible to do. And it's something that right now it's not possible to do it in a physical setting because there is too much interaction, there is any possibility to maintain even a minimum level of social distance. And so that class is not going to happen, and was a sort of missing opportunity that it's not possible to develop in those settings. As far as the job market goes, is a big question mark. So obviously, we just have to don't think too much about that, I think, to don't be too much depressed, to just try to work even harder, to have stuff published, to write a good dissertation, so to make our profile even better, even stronger, and then we will see how the job market will be in a few years from now. And as you know better than me, ISAW is very supportive. So there is already a program in place that try to help students at the end stage of their dissertation to try to compensate with those delays that took place because of the lockdown and all those issues that are taking place. So it's going to be complicated, but for me, if we try to work harder and we are supported by our institute, by NYU in general. So I try to be optimistic and try to see that things actually are going to look up in the next few years. But we will see. It's too much of a big question mark right now. So
yeah, those are a lot of challenges, to be sure. But I think you're right that ultimately, I mean, I had 5 years on the job market before I finally got a permanent job. And I think the strategy of just publishing, keeping your head down and just publishing, eventually, if you can do that, you'll end up with a CV that's so strong that you essentially just have to get a job, right? I mean, but it's the trick is surviving. And so I hope that the job market will improve and that something will work out. But you have already a great publication record and are doing wonderful work. So I have my fingers crossed for you.
And the important is also to keep a positive mentality, because if you start to depress yourself to say, oh, it's never going to happen, you enter this spiral in which it's going to be dangerous for your future in academia. So just to be realistic about the problems that are out there, but from the other end, try to do the best that you can in order to try to go over them.
So that, I mean, brings me to the question, the issue of sort of during COVID-19, I think a lot of people, not just in academia, not just at ISAW, have been struggling with, I guess, mental issues, like the psychology of isolation, essentially, right? So not to be too dramatic about it, but I mean, we basically are thrown into completely different kind of social situations when you're isolating at home. And so I'd like to hear about how you and the people you know have been dealing with that, being a grad student, isolating, and yet somehow carrying on. Amber?
Well, I think for me, since coming back to New York, it did hit hard right away because it is such a much more restricted way of life than we're used to. Not getting to go into ISAW all the time. We have maybe a couple days a week that we come in. When we do come in, the entire community is not there. And so having ISAW have such a strong community base, I know in my first few years at ISAW, that was something that I really leaned heavily on. But at the same time, I think too that even if the ISAW community isn't all there in one building, it has been having that community still around that has really made the difference. So for example, Lorenzo and I live only a couple blocks away from each other, so we see each other semi-regularly. There are still a group of us in New York that try to make sure that we're staying in contact, having Zoom chats regularly to make sure that everybody is doing okay. And then otherwise, it's been a matter of, you have to kind of readjust to a much more home-based lifestyle. So kind of beefing up my home office space was a really important step. And suddenly your home becomes everything. It's your workspace, it's your relaxation space, it's everything it already was, and now it's your workspace, and it's your gym, and it's everything. So just kind of, I think, getting the materials together to make all of those functional in a space, working out a good routine with roommates to make sure that you are supporting each other's schedules, both study schedules, work schedules, exercise schedules, eating schedules, just to make sure that it's kind of a well-oiled machine that is not creating problems in your life, but actually solving them. And that for me has been a big one. And then just having some sense of community, even if you don't get to see people in person all of the time, that you're not just sitting at home for days on end without making contact with another human being. So that's something I've been really grateful for coming back.
That sounds really great. Emily?
Yeah, I mean, it's been strange because I know I couldn't even come into ISAW if I wanted to at the moment. I've been making some pseudo friends in the library. And by that, I mean, we all overhear each other's Zoom conversations. So there are a couple of people doing PhDs that, we give each other knowing looks.
This is the public library in London, right?
Yeah. So there's a woman that I think I'm almost friends with who's doing she studies French early modern literature, and she's doing a PhD that's funded by the National Gallery, and she's doing some cool project there. So I think we're nearly friends. So my pseudo ISAW friends. But yeah, other than that, all of the routine stuff, definitely. I try and keep in touch with everyone from ISAW as much as possible. Make sure I check in, and yeah, otherwise doing nice things like cooking and potting plants and arts and crafts, always good. Did a tapestry, which is pretty fun, of the Bayer tapestry, so it was historical as well.
Glad that all your hobbies are also related to the ancient world.
Of course.
Lorenzo?
I mean, as Amber said, for us that we are still based in New York at the moment, I think that we were very good in checking each other, in keeping in contact one with the other. That was a nice way to don't feel alone, especially if, like me, I'm an international student, I'm from Italy. I was forced to stay in New York City because I cannot move my sample somewhere else. So if I leave the US, I'm not able to finish my dissertation. So it wasn't an option to say I'm flying back at home, I stay with my family and so on. So to have a very nice community in which we speak through Zoom, we meet whenever possible outside with social distance and so on, was a nice way to don't feel too much isolated and to try to cope on an emotional level to this whole situation. And then, as Amber said, you know, the problem of having your office in your home for me was even worse because it was the lab in my home. So, you know, you are you are relaxing, you are listening some music, you are reading a book, you put up your head, you see the microscope on the table that is looking at you and say, come here and do work that you need to finish the dissertation. So it's pretty much hard to find some completely off work time in this sort of situation. And, you know, we tend all to work too much from many point of view. So in this kind of settings, probably the risk is to work even more than what we are expected to work. Our advisors are going to be very happy probably, but for us, it's always, you know, delicate to find an healthy balance between the amount of work and the amount of relax and rest that you, or other things that you can put in your day.
Well, I'm glad to hear you guys are all doing well. And, you know, I think maybe ending on the sense of community and organizing our lives is probably a good place to stop. We have about 5 minutes left, or a few minutes left anyway. So we can take questions from the audience in chat. I'm going to hand it over to Iris to moderate that.
Hi again, everyone. Even though I know you all quite well, it's been really wonderful listening to everyone talk, and feels good to hear all the impressive stuff you've all been doing. We do have a couple of questions that we may only have time for one that had been sent in. The first one is talking, I mean, and I don't know if any of you or any of us can really answer this, but it's an interesting question to think through, and ending on the one hand with the community, maybe this also gives us a chance to look forward. All the international research projects that you've worked in Copenhagen or the excavations in Turkey, are they still running in their respective countries? And sorry to ask it, but do you intend to return to them when and if you are able? I don't know who wants to answer that first, but I leave the floor to you.
Okay, so I have projects in China. They're continuing. I intend to go back next year and just sort of do a double field season, basically.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, for us in Turkey, the excavation this summer was keep going, so it took place regularly, but it wasn't allowed to take place because of regulation in international travel from NYU. So sadly, after 15 years, I had to not attend an excavation during the summer. So it was the first time. But next year, we hopefully we are going to catch up on the excavation work.
So for my part, the papyri aren't going anywhere. So as soon as travel opens up, then yes, I would intend to head back to Copenhagen. We have a kind of international research collaborative that's aimed at publishing all of the scientific texts in that papyrus collection. And so that has experienced a little bit more delay. We actually got a grant from the National Endowment for Humanities that, thank you, Iris, that was for the purpose of hosting a kind of interdisciplinary conference on ancient sciences. And those conferences really rely on bringing scholars, especially experts in these fields, together, because a lot of the time the papers are excellent, but the conversation that happens in and around them is really important in terms of that interdisciplinary knowledge. So that is had to be pushed back. But again, it's about what can you do in the meantime. We're going to host an online program a little bit sooner and then push that conference back a little farther in hopes that travel will open up again at some point.
Really quickly, because we are coming to the end of our time, but the last question is about how an NYU student would get involved with ISAW, and I'm guessing it's a sophomore and undergraduate sophomore. I will put in some information about the website in the chat, and also let you know that we are still having our public lectures. They're online, and you can go to our website and register for all of those. I do think that, and Rod, maybe you can answer this, some ISAW students and faculty members do give classes, undergraduate classes. So I don't know if you can mention anything about that.
Yeah, I mean, we largely teach. For instance, the course that Soren Stark teaches on Silk Road, there's a certain amount of teaching in the freshman seminar. I've taught in the freshman seminar before. Other than that, we have public lectures, of course, that undergraduates are welcome to attend. But I mean, by and large, ISAW is a PhD program. So yeah, Amber?
I just want to add to that, Rod, that the ISAW Student Council has recently started an Ancient World graduate workshop series. And this is to kind of connect students of the ancient world across New York and even a little bit farther abroad. In terms of opportunities to give papers, that is really restricted to master's and PhD students, but undergrads are always welcome to tune into those events and just get a little bit more experience of what happens in these types of lectures, asking questions at conferences. These types of skills can be useful too. So undergrads are always welcome to sign up for that.
Great, thanks.
I don't know if, I know, Rod, you have another class to teach shortly, which is obviously important, but we have one question that I think is interesting. How do you make a case for studying on site instead of online? I know sometimes obviously with the lab work and excavating that does have to be made on site, but other than the actual physical act of excavating, how do you make a case for studying on site in a collaborative environment instead of online?
I mean, if there wasn't the pandemic, I would much prefer presence. There's a certain amount of, I think, interpersonal interaction that just gets lost online. In some ways it's convenient for scheduling, but it's just not the same. It also is a little less spontaneous because we have to be quite disciplined about not interrupting each other, or and you can only kind of look at one face at a time. Anyway, it's just a different experience. And that's all in addition to the fact that there's some things you simply cannot do online. Hands-on type things like, lab work or anything like that. So yeah, so I think when this is all over, I'm definitely not going to run Zoom classes. In person is much better.
And as we draw to 1:50, I think we can call it a day, call it a session. Thank you, all of you, students and Rod, for participating today from London and the city and upstate. And thank you everyone who attended. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us. I think the contact information is in the listing on the platform for Alumni and Parents Weekend. Thank you, NYU Alumni and Parents Weekend staff, for helping put this together. And if you have any, maybe we can see you at an upcoming public lecture. Our next one is actually next week. So thank you, everyone, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Great to see you all. Bye.